Hello and welcome to the future of classical music. I'm David Taylor and this is my show about big ideas and the people behind them. Today I'm talking with Sam Jackson, controller of BBC Radio 3 and the BBC Proms. The BBC Proms is the world's largest and longest running classical music festival, taking place over 8 weeks each summer. With concerts broadcast on the radio and on television around the world, and featuring international artists and orchestras, it is one of the most important, visible and impactful parts of the classical music industry. However, everyone has an opinion on the Proms and the BBC itself. For some, the festival is guilty of dumbing down, and for others, of not doing enough to be more accessible. The BBC Proms is always an easy target for clickbait articles, and as a full confession, I've written a couple myself. But with the digital world continuing to impact the world of broadcast, changing consumer trends, and real-term cuts at the BBC, there are some challenges that the BBC Proms faces that are really worth looking at. So, with the BBC Proms about to start on July 18th, I thought it would be great to dive into it all with the person in charge, Sam Jackson. We spoke about how the BBC works and making decisions as part of a large organisation, what impact for the BBC Proms looks like, and the challenge of programming a festival for a broad church of audiences, when what the Proms means to them and what they are looking for can sometimes be very different and even conflicting things. We also dive into some more challenging areas, such as whether the BBC Proms has fulfilled its potential in the digital world, whether the broadcast of the Proms has kept up with advances elsewhere in the industry, and AI and innovation. I'd really like to thank Sam for being up for the challenging questions, and I certainly learned a lot from his answers. This is one of my favourite chats I've had for a long time, and I found it really enlightening. I hope you do too, so let's jump in. Hi, Sam Jackson. You are the controller of BBC Radio 3 and the Proms. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, David. Good to see you.
It's a pleasure. So I thought as an introduction, it'd be great just to give an overview of the BBC and classical music. So am I right in thinking that quote unquote BBC Classical is the overarching term for everything classical music at the BBC? And then from there, what would come under that umbrella term and how do you fit into it all?
So we don't tend to use BBC Classical as a name per se. We sit within BBC Music, so that's our overall division, and the classical element of BBC Music is obviously a huge and a very important one. Within that, you have obviously Radio 3 and the Proms as well, but also every single piece of activity pretty much that is done by our orchestras and choirs across the country. You know, they're a hugely important part of what we do. So we have concert series that take place. We have, of course, the concerts at the Proms, but also, you know, in other parts of the country, we have all of our music education work. Those orchestras, it should be said, as well as the singers, do a lot of work for our other radio networks. I mean, they're on Radio 2 in the Concert Orchestra's case with Piano Room. The singers were on the One Show relatively recently. We try and make sure that we're using those ensembles right across the BBC. But in terms of the overall classical offer, yeah, it's Radio 3, of course, including Radio 3 Unwind, and then all of the activity that sits within the Proms and our live performance work and education. So it's quite a lot.
It really is, and it's such a diverse thing. For the purposes of this chat and with the Proms on the horizon, we'll stick to there, but I'm sure there could be a million and one questions otherwise. One thing I always find with talking about the BBC is people look at the size of the organisation and the resources the BBC have, and quite rightly have really high expectations. But they often forget that it isn't just one person sat there with absolute control, unlimited resources, who can make a decision instantly, press a button, and something happens the next day. The BBC is such a huge organisation, as you've just outlined, with people in different places, across different departments, with different priorities. To be able to do your job in a leadership position, what's your decision-making framework if you have one? And if so, what does it look like?
It's a really good question. And I think that we hold sort of two things in happy tension, actually. One is that we have an immense amount of creative freedom at the BBC. So if you're in a role such as mine, you're really trusted to do your job. And I would very much hope that that flows through to other people in the organisation. If you are the producer of a particular programme or the editor of a certain strand, as we call them, you are trusted to make that programme because it's been commissioned. You won that commission. You're acknowledged as being somebody who's very, very good at your job. And that would flow through to people who are running our orchestras, for example. So you have that freedom, and with that comes the ability to be quite fleet of foot. So if we want to do something on Radio 3, I mean, we're talking on a Friday afternoon tomorrow. It's Satie Day, where we're marking the centenary of Eric Satie. We've had a whole range of programs, which is everything from live performance of his music through to a celebration of Satie in film, through to his influence on prog rock and synth pop. We've done that because we just are trusted to get on, and that's what me and my team are paid to do for a living. So you've got the happy creative freedom. What you then have in an organisation the size of the BBC, and I think this is the case in any organisation where you've got a lot of people, a lot of departments, you do also then have to navigate people will sometimes call it internal politics. It isn't that. It's just simply how the place works. If we want to make something happen that's not within our immediate gift, then we need to foster a real spirit of collaboration, and we need to find those people who will really deliver for us and who we can work with. And I think, we all have such a view of the BBC here in this country and indeed abroad, we can sometimes forget it's just people, and you have to find those people that will enable you to get things done. So I always say the Proms is the ultimate team effort, because yes, you have the people programming it, but I mean, we had yesterday a big meet and greet at the Royal Albert Hall with all of our team and all of theirs. And within that, you've got security, box office, lighting. You've got people who are doing comms. You've got people working on the artistic programming, and many, many more things besides. So you have the real freedom on the one hand, and then you have the how do I navigate my way through on the other. But I think, as I said, they can exist happily together.
That's really exciting and really reassuring to hear that there's a level of empowering and trust that goes on, which may not always be the case in all organisations. And for one that is so large, there could be a temptation to sort of move away from that, where it sounds like it's doing the opposite in that.
Yeah, and that surprised me coming in, I have to say, David. I mean, I didn't believe that just sort of culturally there would be as much freedom as there is in the BBC. That's not to say that we don't question and challenge ideas. It's not a free-for-all. It's not that people can just come in and do anything without questions being asked. But there is a very healthy view, I think, that anybody, no matter what their role in the organisation, if they're doing that job, they've got that role through a competitive process. They've been acknowledged as somebody who has real skills in that area, whatever the area may be. And so they are encouraged to crack on with the support of people above and around them. Absolutely. But yeah, it was something that was a very pleasant surprise.
Fantastic. So moving on to the Proms, I saw an interview with you earlier this year where you were asked, in your world, how do you define success? And your answer to this was, I would sum it up in one word: impact. When it comes to the Proms, what would you define impact as?
I think I would define it in a number of different ways. So I think we have to start from the point of view of saying we're a public service broadcaster, and we are the custodians of the biggest classical music festival in the world. So with that comes real responsibility to do things that are different to what you would get elsewhere, to use the fact that we're publicly funded to make things happen, frankly, that it would be really difficult to do within a commercial environment. So that is anything from staging really quite complex and challenging repertoire that will not draw a full hall, at the Royal Albert Hall or elsewhere, but that we believe should be heard, and we believe there are fans of that repertoire, both old and new, who the BBC should be giving an opportunity to hear that music. It could be about championing artists who are not going to get the same level of exposure that they would elsewhere. I mean, impact for me is also unashamedly about numbers. I think, there's nothing wrong with looking and saying, how can we encourage more people to experience this festival that they, as license fee payers, fund? And that can be in the venues themselves, or it can be through broadcast. And so, we're looking all the time at saying, okay, we have this incredible festival, the greatest musicians in the world. We take that responsibility very seriously to provide a real depth of repertoire, to provide something for everybody. But how can we enable people to go deeper into the Proms? And I think it's also really important to state that's not just about newcomers to classical music. There can be a common misconception sometimes that the moment you talk about reaching audiences is only about saying people who've never attended a concert. It isn't just that. It's also those people who already love this music, but could go even deeper with it. They might listen to 2 or 3 or even 10 Proms, how can we package this content? How can we present this music to them? What can we do with the proms that means they experience it to an even greater level of depth and therefore enjoyment?
I think depth is a really, really fascinating way of framing that. And as you say, sort of it could be different completely to different people. So, for
Mm,
example, more concerts and frequency of the same type of thing, or it could be exploring new things they've not done before or things outside their comfort zone. And that can
mm.
be a real leveler when you describe it as depth rather than volume or new audiences, which I think is really
Yeah.
positive.
Yeah, and I think for me it's about looking and saying, okay, how do we do this in a way that genuinely feels like the BBC? So the example I'd give from this year, we're doing a Great British Classics prom. Now, about a year ago, when I was talking with colleagues within TV, they were saying, look, we would love to have a prom of British music. We think it would go down really well on BBC Two and on iPlayer, and we'd love to have something. And we looked at that and thought, look, of course we can do a prom of British music. It's not particularly difficult. In many ways, it's easy. But what we very deliberately avoided doing, and to be clear, there was no pressure from our TV colleagues to go down this route, but we very much avoided kind of just doing the obvious, because we could put on a prom that only had very well-known British repertoire in it, and it would sell out. And yes, it would go down very well on TV and indeed on radio. Um, but alongside the Enigma Variations and the Lark Ascending, we're also including music by Grace Williams and William Matthias, and we have a world premiere by John Rutter. And we know that the sound world, we know that the content will work really well, but we're not just playing it safe, because I just think that's not what we're here to do. So even within a context of something which is very, very sort of mass appeal in terms of the proms, we still want to introduce new names. We want to champion underrepresented composers. We want to demonstrate that there's a real breadth of repertoire within classical music that isn't only the pieces that people would know and love.
Definitely. It's really good you've touched on programming as you've set up my next question really well. So huge thank you for that one. But I'm aware that this is going to be a bit of a weird setup, so do bear with me. So in the UK, the Conservative Party regularly describes itself as a broad church. They are home to a range of people with a variety of views, and sometimes they are at odds with each other. And I feel that sometimes the same can be said for both the proms and its audience.
Hmm.
This isn't something that I want to go into in this chat, but we saw this a couple of years ago with the discussion around whether Rule Britannia should be included in Last Night at the Proms. And there was online in the news a wide range of views, and people felt very passionate about it in a wide variety of ways. How do you start to program a prom season for such a broad church of an audience when the proms means so much to them, but also can be very different and even conflicting at times?
I mean, I think this plays into the heart of what the BBC is as an organisation which is funded by everybody, and we therefore have a responsibility as an organisation to reflect the society that we live in and to provide content to people, whatever their background, whatever their political views, wherever they are in the country, whatever their upbringing. It is an organisation that speaks to and speaks for them. I mean, a few things I think on the proms. Firstly, much as I love the idea of more and more people experiencing the proms, it's not a festival for every single license fee payer in the whole country, in the same way that The Traitors isn't a TV program for every single license fee payer. Not everybody is going to come to the proms or listen to it or watch it. So you're talking about already a group of people for whom classical music is or could be something that they would enjoy. What we then look at is say, right, across the course of any one season, I am probably about the only person who will go to nearly every single prom. Most people if they come to a prom at all, they come to one or maybe two. And that's quite normal if you think about your own life. How often do you go to the theatre in a 3-month period, or go to a football match? Most people don't go to the same sort of thing a lot. Some do, the real super fans. But we're therefore looking and saying, across the course of any season, how can we make sure that people who want to experience classical music, orchestral music, have something there for them? So that will include the sort of very established classical music fan who's really interested in hearing world premiere performances, because actually they've been to see the Planets and the New World Symphony many, many times over decades. They're not really necessarily interested in seeing that. It will also include the person who's dipping their toe into classical music. It will also include those who, if you look at something like Soul Revolution, or you look at what we're doing with Anushka Shankar or Aruj Aftab, would like to come to something that's a little more alternative. It's not a classical offering, but it has that kind of musical experimentation and sense of joy at its core, which is of course what the Proms has. And then beyond that, you're looking at CBeebies and many other things besides. So when we say the Proms, it's actually a number of different concerts that appeal to a lot of different people. But we hope that whichever one you come to, there's that same sense of musical discovery, sense of adventure, and sense of being made to feel welcome. So yes, it is a broad church, but I think the fact that we happily have an 8-week season and an awful lot of concerts means that within that, I would hope we can offer something that pleases everyone who might like to come along.
Definitely, and sort of, if you were say to describe it as a buffet, you're not compulsively obliged to eat every different thing at a buffet. There's a wide range for people, and
Yeah.
today's the first day of Glastonbury, and similarly, not everyone is going to every stage to see every artist. It's meant to be some options to choose from.
Exactly. And I think even in those parts of the Proms that are very similar every year, there are still ways of developing the festival and offering something additional, not different, just something more. So the last night actually is a good example of that this year. I felt coming into this role that actually that section on BBC One, which has a lot of the very famous music in it and the very famous finale to the last night, all of that is kind of historic music. It's well loved by a lot of people, but you never hear anything new at that point. And this is a big primetime moment. It's the moment for classical music of the year. There's 3.5, 4 million people or whatever it is watching that. And so what we've done this year is we've commissioned Rachel Portman, the first woman to win a Oscar for Best Original Score. We've commissioned Rachel, a British composer, to write a piece of music for that section. So that will come just before the very famous sea songs, Britannia and everything else. So I think you can keep and you can celebrate and you can offer tradition for those who want it, but that's not at the expense of offering the new and offering something that people haven't heard before. So I hope when people watch or listen to or attend the last night this year, they'll see that actually those two things can exist in harmony, and that's something that I very much want to kind of push into and see how can we continue to do that, celebrate the traditions people love, but also offer something new.
I think that's a really interesting thing. And doing a little bit of digging before this interview into the sort of the history of the Proms, I saw that Henry Woods used to deliberately do different arrangements of well-known pieces to keep both the audience and also the orchestra guessing.
Yeah,
And I guess that idea of freshness and new and experimentation is almost like harking back to that ethos that was at the core of the founding principles.
absolutely. Yes, I think it's easy, isn't it, to sort of imagine that the Proms way back when, or indeed anything in history, was more sort of more refined, I guess, than it was. There was a huge amount of change. There were there was popular music of the day in the Proms. I mean, I always find it slightly tedious when questions are asked about, oh well, if it's a classical music festival, how on earth could you have a Soul Revolution Prom and have an orchestra playing soul music? And you think, well, have you looked at the early running orders of the Proms? Because there was popular music of that time interspersed with classical music. It's always been a festival with classical music at its heart, but it's also always had the confidence to look slightly beyond that and look at other complementary genres and see how can we reflect music in that way. So yeah, I agree.
Definitely. And one of my other favourite little facts I found out was that eating, drinking, and smoking were allowed in Proms concerts, but you were asked to refrain from striking a match when you were lighting up, which is another sort of sign to, I guess, experimentation or more relaxed environment.
Yeah. Maybe we could bring that in for our late night Proms. Maybe not. I think the Royal Albert Hall would have a little thing or two to say about that.
Yeah, I'm sure the listed building and health and safety would be fantastic there.
Yeah, quite.
Certainly. So, speaking of Proms meaning lots of things to different people, the Proms is a special place in my heart because the reason I got into music and started playing the cello was from seeing someone play the cello on the Proms on TV as a kid.
Oh, was it? Oh, that's great. I love
so this is
like that.
that's the Proms is to blame for me being involved in this world now. But however, for me growing up in rural North Yorkshire, I didn't actually get to attend a Prom for a long period of time. And I've loved seeing that now sort of we're moving forwards and the Proms is now moving out into the rest of the country and it's no longer geographically constrained in the way it was. Are there plans to sort of expand this further for the Proms to be around the country in a more permanent setup?
I mean, yes, is the short answer. It's a really, really important part of what we do. And it's funny now to imagine a world in which the Proms was only in London, where we had everything at the Royal Albert Hall and then chamber music at Cadogan Hall. I mean, the Albert Hall are amazing partners, and we love working with them. And the hall will always be the sort of the engine room of the Proms, and of the sort of, 86 concerts this year, 72 of those I think are at the Royal Albert Hall. So it's not about diminishing what's in London; it's about building on that. And as you say, David, offering people that opportunity more locally to them. And I really try and make sure that I get around the country to as many of those Proms as I can each season, because you see that joy firsthand, people on the ground. And I talk to the audience, and last year I had a great time in Gateshead, where at one of the Proms I was in some nice seats with the team from the venue, and the mayor of the Northeast was there as well, and I was talking to her and talking to her husband. And then in the interval, she said to me, "Should we go down the bottom? Should we just go down and prom with everyone else? It looks a bit more fun." And I said, "You know what? Yeah, I'd be really up for that." So I went down there, and we were there and talked to some people there and talked about the Proms coming to the Northeast. And people are just overjoyed to see that kind of offer from the BBC in their patch. And it's really, really important. So absolutely, I want us to do more across the UK. And in 2027, it will be the centenary of the BBC Proms, 100 years of us being the custodians of this festival. I think that's a great opportunity for us to say, right, what could we do in terms of raising our ambition around the country? What could the Proms across the UK look like? That's a conversation we're having as a team at the moment. So yeah, really important part of what we do.
Oh, fantastic. The Yorkshireman in me is very happy to hear that, which is fantastic.
Good.
Certainly. So in terms of, again, connecting with people around the world and also within this country, obviously digital is a huge part of connecting people in the age we live in. From doing, again, a bit of research before coming into this, I looked at some of the most viewed Proms videos on YouTube and found that the 10 most viewed videos have a total of 151 million views, but none of those are posted by the BBC and been uploaded by random people. And in fact, only 3 of the top 20 are from the BBC. Also, in addition, we saw that when the Proms partnered with TikTok in 2023, which I think was an incredibly progressive and exciting move, the BBC Proms didn't then also go the next step of creating a TikTok account, which kind of felt like a missed opportunity. Do you feel there's BBC's managed to sort of fulfill its potential in the digital world when there's obviously such a huge appetite for it? And what are your hopes for the Proms online in the future?
I think there's always more we can do. And I think, speaking really frankly, no, we haven't fulfilled our potential yet. I mean, YouTube's a really interesting one. We have a lot of conversations in the BBC about YouTube. It's such an important platform. It's where so many people are going for their content. I think, we're very mindful that if we put a lot of content up on YouTube, that that's not on iPlayer then. And in terms of people associating that content with the BBC, there's something quite powerful about people really realizing that what they're seeing on their screens is coming from the BBC that they pay for. And there is something of a risk about if it's on another platform, is that sort of is that going to cut through as much? However, I mean, speaking honestly, I think we have to acknowledge that we need to be where the audience are. We need to not, I'm not saying that we should be putting everything up there long form for free for anybody in the world to watch. It's a different kind of point. But in terms of drawing people into the world of the Proms, to the world of classical music from the BBC, I'd say we definitely have work to do on YouTube. And on the point on social media, I mean, when I came into this role, we had one person doing some social media for Radio 3, doing the best that they could, but we really weren't in the game, to be honest, because we hadn't, as an organisation, resourced this part of the BBC as really it needed to be resourced. Happily, we're now in a different place. We have people who are developing and working on social media and developing our strategy. We're seeing really good numbers just off the back of some recent work, but again, there's more to be done, absolutely. And making sure that we're in, as I say, in those places where the audience are already and connecting with them. The world is changing so rapidly, we need to make sure we move quicker.
Definitely. I guess it almost ties back into what we started the conversation with, that people have a perception of the BBC of this huge, incredibly well-resourced organisation, which it is. But in some scenarios, there aren't as many people involved as you may think in departments or programmes and different things. It usually is a very small and finite setup.
It is. And I think the challenge for the BBC, in a world in which over the last decade, the BBC's content budget in real terms has fallen by about 30%, the challenge is to make sure that we're really spending our money wisely on the things that the audience really, really care about. And I think that quite rightly, there's therefore been something of a reticence about putting too much resource, too much attention into, say, other platforms that could potentially detract from what we're doing with the main offer of what the BBC has in terms of content. But I think, where we are at now, we acknowledge that absolutely audience behavior is changing. We see that through, I think it's really interesting with some of our TV programs, how back in the day, and when I say back in the day, we're only talking really a few years back, the overnights people would talk about in TV is critically important. How many people watched it? Well, what were the overnights? And I've never worked directly in telly, but have been around enough to hear that being referenced. And now it's much more about what are the numbers on iPlayer, and we will very often see that, okay, there might be a certain overnight figure for that linear broadcast of a TV program, but is very, very quickly overtaken by the number of people who are watching that program on iPlayer. And a similar thing on sounds. I was just looking today at, we've just come to the end of a series called Brass Banding with Hannah Peel, goes out or has gone out on a Sunday evening. More than half of the listening on sounds, I think it's 55%, was on demand listening. So that's only on BBC Sounds. We don't know how many were listening on FM or DAB, but actually that is a program where people who want to listen to brass band music know that they can go and enjoy a really good series right now. And again, that we see that audience behavior changing all the time, and we've got to move quickly to reflect that.
I think it's a really interesting point. It's I'm going to try and resist the temptation to move off and speak about radio the entire time, which is another area we could spend another hour speaking about. But for example, I'm always fascinated with the radio figures that come out, and people sort of then again not acknowledging the BBC Sounds, etc. Shows a personal example. I never ever listen to radio for. It's not something that goes on. I never turn the radio on. However, every day I'm listening to multiple programs on catch up on BBC Sounds. So it's that isn't necessarily acknowledged when you see these big figures and headlines.
It's not, and I think that is something of a tension for us, because we know that in terms of the stories that the press will cover still will be how many listeners has radio whatever got. It could be Radio 3, they could be talking about Radio 2, commercial radio, whatever. But actually we know that in terms of giving the audience what they want, more and more people are expecting, whatever the platform, they're expecting to be able to go and get the content that they want at any given time of day. Now, that doesn't for a moment negate the joy of live radio. And I think if you're listening at breakfast time to a live program, whatever the music genre, or if it's a news program, there's something very special about knowing that that presenter is right there talking to you in real time. But when it comes to a program such as Composer of the Week, we've just come to the end of a run of programs about Gavin Bryars. Most people don't necessarily want to listen to that at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. They want to listen to it whenever suits them. It might be 5 o'clock, it could be 10 in the morning. We're seeing that more and more for that kind of program. Sound of Cinema, the early music show, whatever it may be. Lots of people love live radio. I love listening to live radio, but we've sort of educated ourselves, I think, over recent years. If you think about TV viewing and how quickly that has moved to streaming, I think we're seeing very similar things in radio. So again, the sort of happy tension there is, how do you protect live radio, which is really important and really special, whilst also developing that on-demand offer and telling listeners, explaining to listeners where they can go to get what they want to listen to.
Definitely. I'm going to try and do an incredibly smooth segue now. So radio is obviously such a key part of the broadcast element of the BBC, and broadcasting is such an important part of the proms. There we go, segue.
There we go. Nicely done.
Thank you. Since the pandemic, we've seen lots of classical music organisations start to film and broadcast their performances themselves, and I've been really excited to see some really great innovation in that space. Looking back at the pandemic itself, things like LA Phil Soundstage or the Queensland Symphony Orchestra or the Philharmonia putting out some incredibly stunning content.
Yeah.
Looking elsewhere inside the BBC, we've also seen things like broadcast and coverage around events start to innovate as well, with football and the Olympics looking and feeling very different as to how they did 10 years ago. You may have a slightly different opinion, but to me, it feels like broadcast of the proms look and feel kind of how they did 10 and even over 10 years ago, and potentially maybe sort of lagging behind elsewhere in the industry. Do you feel there's some potential room for innovation there?
I think, look, with any kind of TV format, there's always room for innovation. I think you've got to look every year and say, right, how do we, similar to what I was saying earlier around the kind of musical programming, how do you keep the things that people know and love? But how do you bring something new? And whilst I'm not directly responsible for the TV output, I absolutely acknowledge that we should always be asking that question. I think we had a very good year last year. It was about 13.5 million people who watched that TV coverage. But that doesn't mean there couldn't be more, and it doesn't mean we couldn't, bring an even greater level of joy to those audiences. So absolutely, I think we are looking at that with our production company, and I know that my TV commissioning colleagues ask those questions. It's interesting. I was talking to the BBC's he's not that new anymore, but the BBC's director of sport just earlier this week, and obviously they've got a big change coming in terms of 3 new presenters on Match of the Day, and that will be in August, and we'll be seeing Kelly and Gavi and Mark doing that programme, and that is something that is absolutely loved by so many people. That format, I love watching Match of the Day, and as a viewer, I sort of think, don't change too much. But actually, he's got some ideas around some innovations that will come in to complement what is already on offer. Of course, we're always open to those ideas of what we do. And I think you'll see it with some of the presenters who we're using this year, bringing in some other people, bringing in some contributors who maybe offer something slightly different. And on things like camera angles, I think there are some fun things that we've talked about and we'd love to do to really bring people even further up close to musicians. And are there things that we can do within the constraints of how you can film in the Albert Hall and how you make sure you're not either driving a musician mad by putting a camera practically up the nose, or the audience in the hall are getting really frustrated because their sightline is exposed, obscured. So there's all those conversations and more are had. But I take the point that you could say that there's more we could be doing, and that in that area.
I guess it goes back to that broad church point as well. This is pre-pandemic, and I have some non-musical friends who invited me to watch the Christmas streaming of Andre Rieu's Christmas concerts or New Year's Day concert at the cinema. And this was in summer while I was at the pub, and apparently I agreed and completely forgot for 6 months. So I went along and tried to keep an open mind for something that wouldn't be something I'd normally go to, and was fascinated by the coverage of it. And the presenter pre, mid, and post concerts wasn't up in a box. They were down on the floor in the audience, and you got a real sense of that buzz in the same way that you may have done at Gateshead with that promming experience.
Yeah.
So for me, as someone who likes seeing things change, that to me would be, I would love it if the Proms did that. But to someone else, that iconic view of presenters with the sort of up in the gods with the giant acoustic domes behind them may also be something they would never want to change.
Yeah, I think that's a really great example. And look, personally, if just simply as a viewer, I would like to have the presenter out on the stage. I would enjoy that sense of closeness to the orchestra, to the audience. That would naturally be what I would want to watch. Doesn't mean I don't enjoy it when they're up in the gods. Somebody else will feel very different. I mean, with the Proms last year, we had Mel Gedroich, we had Edith Bowman, both hosting. I remember being at both of their Proms where they were presenting for TV, but from the stage in front of the audience, and that went really, really well. And the experience in the hall was a very positive one. I don't recall anybody saying afterwards, "Oh, what a shame that those presenters were on the stage." And I think it's an interesting point. Could we have the last night of the Proms where Casey is actually on stage presenting in the hall? Potentially, we could do. I think it's those sorts of questions we absolutely should ask, even if the answer in the end is no. Do you know what? For actually really, really good reasons, we should stick with doing what we're doing because the audience really like it.
Yeah, certainly. And it's I think it's always fun to see sort of what other people do, and you can either take inspiration or, like you say that's good but not the right solution for us.
Yeah,
I've a couple of times I've tried out the Philharmonia's VR virtual reality
Oh, yeah.
orchestra, and it is fascinating because you can potentially see up the nose of some of them, but that some of the intimacy and like little winks you get between desk partners that you wouldn't may necessarily have seen. But I guess one of the luxuries of it being 360 is they may not feel quite as under pressure of it as if it's a 2-dimensional camera looking at them.
But
For that side.
lovely, that idea that you're really, really up close and you're bringing people to the center of that musical experience, definitely.
Definitely. So speaking of innovation, something that many people might not know, and certainly something I didn't know until a few years ago, is about the BBC's research and development team and some of the incredible work that they do, particularly in the music world. And I also didn't know that the work and the technology they create are then released to the public free of charge as part of the BBC's Royal Charter, which again is an incredible outlet that doesn't get enough credit. With artificial intelligence being such an important issue and technology at the moment, what are the BBC Music sort of thoughts around AI, and is it something you're using already? And also, is there anything else from the BBC's R&D work in music that
Mm.
you wish more people knew about?
So I think AI is a topic, it won't surprise you to hear, David, that is talked about a lot within the BBC, as in pretty much any other organisation. And I remember attending just a few weeks back a speech that the Director General gave in Salford, where he was talking about wanting to really harness the positive benefits of AI for audiences, because of course there are many questions about AI, and there are things we have to be careful about, and the BBC is really careful, and we have very, very strict guidelines. We have approved tools that we can use, which I do use, and we have ones that are not approved and that we should not be using, and we're very, very careful on that front, because we are such a trusted organisation, and the moment anything that we do is and the moment that trust is undermined by anything we do, that's a sort of terrible position to be in. So we're very, very careful. We give it a lot of thought, and any AI tools that we have are sort of checked, vetted, approved. But I remember hearing the DG say in this speech, imagine if through the power of AI, the BBC could give every child in this country effectively their own personal tutor. So rather than this being sort of the preserve of the wealthy, where when your child's got their GCSEs, you sort of bump up their school tuition by getting a private tutor. And I'm not judging that. I'm just, simply saying a very, very small number of people really could afford to do that. What if there was something that the BBC could offer where whoever you are, wherever you live in this country, whatever your family background, that you could go on and access something that really helped you with your music GCSE revision or history or, French or whatever. So I think that's quite exciting. It has to be done well and it has to be done carefully. But if we can open up resources and think right back to that Reithian aim that we would educate as part of, our mission, as well as informing and entertaining. I think that's really, really important. We're also having some very, very interesting conversations about how could we use the work of the R&D team to do some quite clever or interesting things with the proms in future years. And that sounds quite vague. It's deliberately so, because if where we get to is where we get to, it'll be really exciting. And my colleagues would absolutely go mad if I announced on this what we were planning. But we are looking and saying, again, how can we use some of the technology and the tools and the research that we're doing to bring music to people in potentially a completely new way, or on platforms that we wouldn't have previously thought could be a home for the proms or for something that Radio 3 is doing. But they're amazing people, and the work that they do is just so interesting. And I would encourage anybody who's listening to us talk to go and have a look at what you point out, David, our free resources.
Yeah, the one that really sticks out to me, which came out during the pandemic, was the pick apart, where you could get a recording of a piece and have it
Yeah.
played on multiple phones, and you could choose which phone played which part,
Yeah.
and you could also mute it. So, for example, you could play along with a string quartet and mute the cellist and be the cellist, or play around with what acoustics would look like. I'm assuming this might be okay to talk about, so feel free to cut me off if it's not. But when I went and had a play there, I think it was 2019 or 2018, which is why hopefully this is okay. But one thing was like a zooming spatial audio. So on a TV screen, you could tap on the musician you wanted to hear more of, and then more of that sound would come out, which I thought was really fascinating. And that was for both things like Glastonbury, but also orchestra music as well.
Yeah. I haven't come across that one, so I have to go and check it out, because that sounds very up our street.
Either that or I've just completely released a state secret into the wild. Fantastic. So just to wrap up, I have two questions I love to ask everyone at the end of the podcasts. So nice and easy questions. If you could change one thing in the classical music industry, what would it be and why?
Okay, I've got one that's come straight to mind, and that would be the depressing criticism from a very small section of the classical music industry of anything which seeks to introduce this music to a new audience. I think it's a really bizarre thing that there's a very, very small number. I don't want to overplay it, but I think about when we launched Radio 3 Unwind, which is more classical music from the BBC, is in addition to what we're doing on Radio 3, is drawing in, in the first week of this year alone, 150,000 people listen. So I think that's something to celebrate. And I think it's just joyful that people are coming and listening to more classical music and discovering it that way. And yet, when you open the Telegraph or the Spectator or the Guardian or the Times, all too often you will see something which sort of slightly pours scorn on anything which seeks to broaden out that music. And I've always found that to be very, very strange. This notion that, okay, it might not be for me as the person writing the article, but it's for others. And I think we should be celebrating, Andre Rieu is a great example. Not my kind of thing, but I've been to Maastricht and seen audiences who adore, and at the O2, absolutely adore what he does. And I think if they're enjoying that music, then we should just be very happy about that. So that would be the one I would change.
A really good one. And I guess it goes back to that core theme again of Henry Wood bringing it to the widest possible audience as well.
Absolutely. And I think, we should be challenged by people externally. We should be, I'm not expecting everybody in the press just to write puff pieces about Radio 3. I think we should be I should be asked about, is what we're doing distinctive? Are we championing the kind of challenging repertoire? Are we playing things others aren't? Are we making sure that we're not just chasing numbers? All those things are really, really important questions. And we should be pushed on that. But I think when it tips over into a kind of, oh, good grief, the BBC are doing something to draw in new audiences for classical music, and why can't they just be doing more Varese? It's like, well, because we're doing Varese over here already, but not everybody wants to listen to Varese. Some people might want to listen to something different. That's all right. So yeah, that would be my bugbear.
Definitely. And then finally, a real positive note to end on. What gives you hope for the future of classical music, and where do you see opportunity?
Oh, great question. I think what gives me hope? Well, look, just in terms of our own world, we've had 6 quarters of year-on-year growth for Radio 3 for our listening. And I think in a world in which people say, oh, it's harder and harder to get people to listen to the radio, there are so many demands on people's time, we're seeing that. We've had, this year for the Proms, the opening weekend, we took more ticket revenue than ever before in the history of the Proms. So there's an audience there who are really hungry, and I think that's really exciting. But I'm also really given hope by the individual stories. So I saw only earlier today a story on the NYO socials, National Youth Orchestra socials, where there was a young woman who last year watched the NYO prom on TV and loved it and was inspired, and this year is going to be playing in the NYO prom because she's got into the orchestra and is a musician herself. And I just think that gives me so much kind of hope that there will always be those people and those stories, and it's the job of people like me to provide those routes in and that exposure. So, it's a tough old world out there, and I wish there was more funding for the arts, and I wish that we hadn't seen the decline in GCSE music that we have and all the rest of it. But I think there's still an awful lot of positive stories, and we're in a very, very vibrant industry which has a lot going on and that we should celebrate.
I'd like to thank Sam Jackson, controller of BBC Radio 3 and BBC Proms, for taking the time to join me on the podcast, and thank you for listening. If you'd like to let me know what you think of the podcast, any requests for topics, or in fact anything else, you can email david@david-taylor.org or reach out on social media. You can find links to all of those on the website david-taylor.org. There, you can also find more blogs about the future of classical music, and this week I've been looking at how the Royal Ballet and Opera have been working with influencers to share accessibility stories. If you like the podcast, please share it with your friends and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and I'll see you next time.